Good evening, everyone. Really glad to be back with you again, and I'm extremely pleased to have dragged back to talk to me again Matt Ehret, who's the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review, senior fellow at the American University in Moscow, the author of The Untold History of Canada book series and Clash of the Two Americas. And in 2019, Matt, you founded the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. You've also published the book, The Time Has Come for Canada to Join the New Silk Road. And if people want to go to our previous podcast, which is at my website, thewallwillfall.org, entitled Breaking the Extinction Cycle from COVID to Ukraine with Matt Ehret. Matt, welcome back.
Hey, thank you, Vanessa, for having me back on. It was a pleasure last week, and I'm really happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, well, I think we could have probably gone on for about 3 hours, but
Yeah.
I think it was good to have ended on the positive note that we ended on, and it was nice actually that in the comments I did actually get quite a lot of positive feedback, and people felt encouraged by what you were saying. So I think that's very important at this moment in time because we are going through, I believe, a transformational period in history, and that is always packed full of uncertainty, and for many people, huge difficulty. So I think it's important to try and bring realistic positivity to the discussion. One of the things that we didn't really get into in too much depth in our last conversation was we were addressing the issue of whether Russia and China are part of the transnational global plutocracy leading the Great Reset agenda that many believe was brought in or ushered in by the COVID-19 project, which of course started back in March 2020. And you have argued on a number of panels and on a number of occasions very eloquently, very articulately, and with a huge amount of knowledge and history that this is not the case, that Russia and China and a number of other countries, namely Iran, India, Pakistan, many of the Central African Republic countries, many Middle Eastern countries, Latin American countries, are effectively working towards a non-aligned bloc. In other words, decoupling from Western supremacy and unipolarity, namely, of course, dominated by the United States, but I would also put the UK in there very much so. So I wanted today to dive more into what we touched on last time, which is the effect of the fifth column in both Russia and China. And to start with, can you give a description to the audience of what exactly a fifth column is, who is usually in control of it, and what it is designed to do?
Yes, most certainly. Yeah. So the term fifth column has increasingly become people, I think, in our world, especially since 2016, have been more comfortable with the terminology of deep state as an idea that is really, I think, a new but useful concept in the lexicon of most people who are aware of what's going on in the world. There's an idea now that there is something other than national interest, so that you have forces within various governments of the world. I think every government of the world has elements that are not in allegiance with that particular nation that they happen to operate within embedded within the civil service, within the bureaucracy, within the military, within academia, within media, within intelligence, as different sort of aspects of the same thing. And we have penetrations of this thing you might call a deep state everywhere in the world. Before that term came about, it was more conventional to utilize the term fifth column as that sort of treacherous branch of within and embedded within government institutions that would work for the subversive interests of I mean, the question is, who is controlling fifth columns? Who is controlling these tentacles? That's always up for debate historically. Different people have different idea of who is controlling them during the Cold War. Many Americans believed that it was Russian and Chinese communists who were controlling their spies and agents within their government, and many Russians and Chinese believed, that it was entirely the Americans controlling their spies embedded within their governments. Now, I would say that neither one of those views throughout the Cold War was actually really correct. When you actually look at world history, and especially the 20th century, you really can't get anywhere if you don't take into consideration the existence of an oligarchy above nation states, so that there is a power, a shadow government of that you might want to call it that, above national institutions, utilizing, as it always has, a vast control of finance, of intelligence operations, and a variety of other things that has always been there. And there is a continuity, and this is what I use in my historical research. In the back of my mind, I'm always holding for context the existence of an oligarchical system that transcends individual generations or lifetimes, which goes back really to the collapse of Rome, and maybe even before that, as far as certain families, certain bloodlines that are kept in a dominant position, and around which all authority and hereditary structures of power emanate from one generation to the next. And this is something which, again, is really brushed out or scrubbed out of most modern historical analysis, because this leads us into the dangerous and forbidden domain of conspiracy thinking, which is a sign that you have a mental dysfunction or something like that. But the reality is, I think that this is an important principle, a causal nexus of history, and the 20th century, especially the Cold War, was no exception. So Russia has their own fifth columns, and Putin has recently spoken openly about this, even in March 15th, very, very clearly, which I even have his little quote. I might even read it for the people listening, maybe.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, you don't mind? Okay.
Yeah, no,
It's such a good, strong quote. And it's rare to hear statesmen today speaking so candidly. And I think he's been more, Putin is somebody who's kept his cards close to his chest for much of the 22 plus years he's been a power player. So it's I think now, with the events in Ukraine being what they are, and obviously fissures that Putin and I think many of his collaborators in China and around Russia have been trying to keep from splitting too terribly apart. There's sort of a no going back in some ways, with sanctions, with everything else happening. So I think he's now speaking a lot more candidly. And in this attack on the Russian fifth column, he said on March 15th, yes, of course, the West will bet on the so-called fifth column, our national traders, on those who earn money here with us but live there. And they live there not even in the geographical sense of the word, but according to their thoughts, according to their slavish consciousness. Many of these people, by their very nature, are mentally located exactly there and not here, not with our people, not with Russia. This is, in their opinion, a sign of belonging to a higher caste, a higher race. Such people are ready to sell their own mothers if they were allowed to sit in the hallway of this very highest caste. They do not understand at all that if they are needed by the so-called higher caste, then they are needed only as expendable material in order to use them to inflict maximum damage on our people. That's the end of it's a much longer interview, and I took a small quote, but I thought it was just very powerful.
No, I mean, it was a very powerful statement by him and the entire speech, and you're absolutely right, I think. And I think this is the mistake, or maybe this is what some of these people are overlooking, these analysts and researchers, for whom I have a huge amount of respect, like Ian Davis, who was on the panel, which Whitney Webb was hosting along with Kit Knightley from Off Guardian, is a lot of the rhetoric prior to February the 24th when Russia started its limited military operations in Ukraine, altered drastically after that date. In other words, you started to see a real, in my opinion, a real shift in the rhetoric and a real honesty coming through. I'm not saying that they were being dishonest before, but they were being political before.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, in my opinion, and it'd be interesting to see what you think. I think they were following a strategy to try and not appease the West, but to try and form some kind of collaboration or partnership that would benefit Russia and China. Yes. And I can, on a much smaller scale, but if I go back in history to the early 2000s, for example, when President Assad was effectively being courted by the West because they believed that they could foster a different relationship, according to the Bush and Tony Blair emails that were revealed after, in the Chilcot inquiry into the fraud that was the weapons of mass destruction. Assad at this time also was, if you like, uncharacteristically coming towards the West and agreeing to the CIA black sites, for example, in Syria post 9/11. But of course, at that time, he was combating fairly heavy sanctions that had been brought in as a result of their being against the 91 Gulf War. So, from that perspective, I have a feeling that a lot of what we saw prior to the conflict in Ukraine was very much geopolitical strategizing. It was, and Russians, they are very masterful chess players. I know that's a cliche, but nevertheless, it's very true. What's your opinion on that? If you compare the language, the statements, the rhetoric pre-February 24th, 2022 to after the events took place?
Most certainly I agree. And I think that we often, most people are not anywhere near any actual corridor of real power in the political spectrum. And so it's often easy for us to fall into the trap of, commenting and looking upon things from the outside without appreciating the actual sophistication and reality of very powerful structures of power that exist in many nations, that leaders who might have a good intention, a good orientation, have to negotiate with and navigate around while trying to stay alive at the same time to advance something which is in the benefit of their countries. So there is, and we often, maybe this is because of our media, our movies, our culture, which tends to overly simplify good and evil, to the comic book idea of Lex Luthor versus Superman, and one is clearly evil and one is clearly good. And everyone can see which one is which. There's no need to think about nuance. So we tend to, I think, take that stuff that Hollywood gives us and we transpose it into our analysis of politics. And then we take, sometimes the fact is, bad people will say good things, and they usually do, in order to get support from the masses or advance their own nefarious agenda, but we'll do the opposite. And sometimes good people will say bad things in order to appease powerful players who are evil, but they will then do something which runs contrary to those words that they used. So you really do have to, I think, take the step back sometimes from just what your eyes and ears are seeing and hearing, and look with your mind's eye at the broader context, the historical forces, the higher principles that are shaping the conditions and the potential of our world, because we're living in potential right now for a lot of chaos and hell on earth, and a lot of really good, incredibly good things that could happen, since we are living through the collapse of one system and the pre-creation of a new operating system, which will come online. The question is, what will it be? How will that new operating system be wired? Upon what principles of operation, what definitions of value, what definitions of human beings, our role in the system? That's underdefined. And there's a fight over what that will be. So yeah, when you look at what Putin has done, I mean, he's somebody who is renowned for having gained and ascended to a very high position by getting very bad people, including a lot of Russian oligarchs in the 1990s around Yeltsin, to trust him, to think he was just this pragmatic, cold, calculating ex-KGB guy who would just, look the other way when evil is done, who had no national or moral interests in much of anything beyond himself. He got their trust. And then what we could see through his actions was systematically pulling the rug out from under the feet of many of these same oligarchs who gave him sponsorship earlier on, many of whom were sent into prison in 2000. And, court cases were launched against a variety of these figures. Like we saw Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was one of these big privatizing billionaires who reaped a lot with the help of certain U.S. State Department operatives, George Soros, Victoria Nuland, even being the assistant of Strobe Talbot in the 1990s. So Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who ended up owning Yukos, the biggest oil giant, was given prison time for many, many years in 2005. Platon Lebed, another of these oligarchs, was given 9 years prison time. He also headed one of the biggest groups, Menatap Group, that was formed under the control of people like Larry Summers, who was running the U.S. Treasury. Mm-hmm. There were many others. I mean, I can go through a big list, but those who avoided prison were either those who chose to agree with the new rules that Putin laid down, and people can watch some of these very funny confrontational meetings Putin had with many of these oligarchs at various occasions, where in one case, he's tried to get them to agree to reopen a factory that is on strike, which they're refusing to do because they're all about money. And he says, look, if you don't do this and sign an agreement with the workers, we will just go in and nationalize, as we've nationalized a lot of things. And one of these oligarchs is just pissed off, and he forces him in front of the media, the cameras, to go and sign this contract. And then when the guy disgruntledly goes and embarrassingly does it, he walks away, and Putin's like, hey, that's not your pen. Give me back my pen.
Yeah, I remember this one.
Really drink it. So you have those people who chose to agree to play by the new rules. Some of them did maybe honestly. Other ones perhaps did just to buy time so that they could subvert things later on from within, which is obviously the case. Other ones have just, to avoid prison, escaped, and like Berezovsky went to London. There's a big Russian oligarch section called Moscow on the Thames, where there's these big manors and mansions of Russians who avoided prison. It's not like Putin sent them there to infiltrate the West. They went there because they knew that they would be in prison if they stayed in Russia. And you could see that through their actions. What are the things that these guys, also in Florida, there's a lot of Russian oligarchs there who reaped a lot of money by the destruction of the lives of many Russians in the 90s. And many of them have been working with Soros, with other CIA operations, to promote open society operations in, even Khodorkovsky, who's now out of prison. I think he's in Britain, and he's running an operation to liberalize and promote, liberal thinking in Russia from the outside. Mm-hmm. So there's all of these sorts of things which, Putin has been, it's like a dance with somebody who wants to kill you. The Chinese have been dealing with something similar, where you have to say certain things for diplomatic purposes, and again, keeping your cards to your chest. And then when the opportunities arise, you take your strikes where you can, and then you pull back, and it's this is the sort of thing that real politics is based upon. And now that, again, that we've seen all of Putin's attempts, and there has been obvious attempts to reduce the chance of a new Cold War or hot war from breaking out, which is what Putin's been doing since his Munich speech in Germany in 2007, where he was very clearly putting on the table that he understands the NATO agenda of surrounding Russia with anti-ballistic missiles for the sake of gaining full spectrum dominance over Russia. He put that out there very clearly as awareness and had been trying very clearly to bring about entente with the West to say, look, let's avoid doing things that are going to inflame a total breakdown of East-West relations that could threaten humanity. We saw that with his efforts to try to spark an agreement with Yanukovych of Ukraine, where he wasn't demanding that Yanukovych not join the European Union or anything of the sort. He simply said, let's create something whereby Ukraine can have positive economic relations with Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union at the same time as being a member state of Europe, or the European Union and the Europe. So he definitely tried. That was overthrown. That was not accepted. Whereas the West was of the view that, no, Yanukovych, if you're going to be integrating with us, then you will have no relation with Russia, which is, I mean, it's disastrous because Russia was buying up finished goods. They were that market was the basis to justify Ukraine's heavy industries that were being hollowed out since the late 90s or late 80s. Whereas all Europe wanted of Ukraine was raw materials, resources, oil, and wheat. They didn't want them to have industries or anything that's technologically advanced. Russia was different. So was China. So anyway, that was overthrown. And for 8 years, Putin has been trying really hard. We could see that to avoid, again, it's not like he didn't want to recognize the demands of the people in Lugansk or Donetsk for, becoming sovereign nation states. They're mostly Russian anyway, in terms of their identities and language and everything else. They had a full-blown plebiscite, which is, almost unanimous. Like 90% of the population voted to become an independent countries. And it's not like he didn't want to do that, but he didn't do that. And he continuously tried to defend the Minsk II Accords to keep them as parts of Ukraine. As long as Ukraine just simply didn't join NATO and didn't host US missiles as part of this full spectrum dominance program. And there's so much effort that he tried to do. And it came to the point where, like we discussed last week, there was a lot of evidence that Ukraine was going to go for a full-blown assault, a bloodbath on Crimea and East Donbass. And to avoid that bloodbath, Russia did go in. And it was there's a lot of evidence at this point that came to the surface that was going to happen. And I think if it was permitted, we had the U.S. State Department already, Ned Price, the spokesperson, already laying the groundwork to say that, something bad is going to happen. They were preparing the minds of the people of the West to understand how they should interpret the oncoming bloodbath. And he said, it's going to happen, but Russia's going to blame Kiev. And the reality is they're going to be using crisis actors, and it's going to be a false flag run by Russia to justify an invasion. But don't believe them. So, obviously Russia, if they had let this happen, they would have had to have entered Ukraine anyway, no matter what. That was unavoidable by this time. Yeah. The question is, were they going to stay in a position of influence, or were they going to play into a game controlled by those who want to destroy them? So they chose to go in earlier on, before the bloodbath, as we've seen. And since then, Putin has been more open, let's just say much more openly candid about his understanding of these enemies. He's even passed recently a presidential order firing a variety of people from the scientific committee from the Russian Security Council, who have been Western liberalizers, like Director General of Russian International Affairs, Andrei Kortunov, who's also a darling at RT, Sergey Rugakov, Alexander Panov, like a variety of others who were all part of this nexus that was built up in the 1990s. So you're seeing now a pushback on the biggest one, Anatoly Chubai, whom I recently wrote an article on. He's like the king of this fifth column in many ways, who worked directly. He was a Soros reformer in the 80s and 90s, who was a personal controller and handler of Yeltsin, who oversaw with Yegor Gaidar the privatization, the of everything, right? Of the entire Russian economy during that terrible period of looting. And he has been protected. It's not like Putin hasn't tried to get rid of him. He's hated him. He's called him a CIA stooge in 2013. But despite that, Chubai has something protecting him, as do many of these characters, to the point that he maintained a position as the head of Rusnano from 2007 all the way up until 2020. He had recently been made the head of the ambassador from Russia to the United Nations on sustainable development. He's one of the key characters who's been bringing in Davos programs since the 90s into Russia. The entire Great Reset, Fourth Industrial Revolution idea of just decarbonizing society with windmills, solar panels, and all of this, stuff. This is really Chubai's work, and Chubai has jumped ship. A week ago, he just gave it his announcement saying, "I'm getting out of Russia. Goodbye." And he's tried to make it about his disagreement with the Ukraine conflict. But the reality is, I think he heard this speech, and it was like a day or two later that he was like, "I'm gone," and he went to Turkey. I don't think he's going to come back. There's many more like him.
And I think you mentioned in another interview about that Chubai, or maybe we talked about it, that Chubai very much empowered Tatyana Golova, who was in charge of the health measures basically during COVID.
Oh yeah, I don't know if it was directly Chubai, but Tatyana Golova was certainly she has been somebody as well who was brought into the Ministry of Finance in the 90s. Now she is the Deputy Prime Minister, and as you pointed out, she has been in charge from the get-go of the whole COVID, scamdemic, whatever people want to call it. She's been in charge of all of the emergency protocols. That's her. She was formerly, her qualifications was like she's a Western trained liberal economist who was again brought in the 90s into the finance ministry to oversee a lot of the perestroika. She was made deputy finance minister in 99. She was then made minister of health in 2007, where she worked very closely with her husband, Viktor Cristenko, he was also deputy prime minister at that same time in 98. He was made the minister of industry of Russia for 8 years until 2012. And these are characters who are, again, absolutely ideologically westernized, liberalized to the extreme. Cristenko, her husband, is a disciple of a cybernetics guru named Georgy Shidrovitsky, who's a highly influential nutcase who in the 1950s and 60s created a whole cult following around this idea that there are no such thing as individuals. Individuals have no existence outside of the system of controls, and that is cybernetics. It's the science of control. In fact, if you get behind the Klaus Schwabian Davos ideology of population control, which they really want to bring online as part of this whole Great Reset, it's rooted in the science of cybernetics that was created at the end of World War II, which is just, again, it's a science of control that most people in the system don't need to understand the system. They just need to be hyper-specialized in a very bureaucratized, compartmentalized machine, and only a few people called the helmsmen need to have a sense of the whole. Only a few, privileged few. And that's sort of the origins of the ideology of cybernetics. So these people, they are absolute behaviorists. They don't believe in the idea of justice or soul or God or sacredness or anything. Those are all abstract, useless terms. For them, it's just control. That's all that's real. It's hyper materialist, hyper positivist. And thus for them, and that's why it's so concerning when you look at people like Cristenko, who's still a power player, and his wife Tatyana, being in the positions that they have been and protected as they have been. Both of them enriched themselves immensely under Chubai's period as well, where he gave giant contracts to a variety of pharmaceutical companies in 2008, 2009, 2010, as he was the head of Rosnano, but he was able to then still provide contracts for the science of pharmaceutical technology that enriched both Golokova, her husband, as she was also Minister of Health. They call her the mother of corruption in Russia. That's literally what the mother of graft. She had empowered as well German Gref, who is a high-level World Economic Forum trustee during the COVID-19 operation, to gain, powerful, very, very lucrative contracts to generate their Sputnik 5 formula. The whole thing, though, I mean, if you look around that same time, Chubai had created, upon Gaidar's death, a giant fund to be the Davos of Russia in 2009. It was called the Gaidar Forum, that would take place every year, one week before the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the Gaidar, essentially Davos Forum, was a big part of what brought in the funding, and this is again what he oversaw as the head of Rosnanos, into windmill and solar farms in Russia, which today they're very little. Russia uses a lot of natural gas and oil and fossil fuels, and that's their main priority. And I think they're not stupid enough, as many Western countries, in the science of economy and the science of sustaining populations, where we've become very ignorant. They know that if you just eliminate all of these hydrocarbon fuel sources, you're going to create mass scarcity, starvation, death, and chaos. Whereas we, being just more shaped by computer model thinking and not reality, we make a lot of worse decisions, as we see across Europe and North America now, with the shutdown not only of carbon-based forms of fuel, but also even the shutdown of nuclear power, the cancellation of investments into new forms of fusion power. Research has been massively undercut. And instead, we're all being told that, we're going to have such a better world if we just go for windmills and solar panels and put our economy on those things, which honestly, you can't even make a windmill with a windmill. You can't make a solar panel with a solar panel energy, because all of the industrial heat and energy that is required to make these energy intensive devices, including the mining as well. So much rare earth mining, it's so destructive to nature. You can't do that with the type of energy you get from windmills or solar panels themselves. So it's the very opposite from renewable energy, even though that's how it's sold to us. It's really not. So all that to say, there's this whole network, Golokova being a big one. And just to get back to your main question, as the head of the COVID response, this has confused a lot of critical thinkers and analysts of the West, I think, trying to look and make sense of what Russia's response has been, as well as China, to the COVID issue. And they don't get it, because there's so much similarity to how Russia and China have been responding overhandedly, like with an overbearing response. And there's too much similarity to how the Western world, which is very obviously under the control of very nefarious actors, has been responding to this thing. And they get confused. They're like, well, obviously Russia and China thus must be in on it. And it's like, not really. If you look at Golokova, one of the key things she did is she devolved political authority from the Kremlin, from the federal authorities, down into the regions, as it has happened under World Health Organization protocols everywhere in the world. Everywhere. That we were told the local authorities, the municipal mayors, the governors of regions know better. They're on the ground than those who are in the capital of whatever country. And so they have to have the authority to make mandates. Whatever they think needs to happen, they should have the authority to do it and bypass the constitutional legal frameworks that exist in most nations. And that's what she enforced. And this is where there's been also in China too, similar things. At various times, conflict that we've seen many cases of for 2 years between the federal authorities and people like Golikova has worked very closely with the mayor of Moscow, Sergey Sobyanin. And he's tried at various times to punish people with fines for not being vaccinated, for doing a variety of things, as have many of the regions. And she has tended to support him. And he's been a proponent for 20 years of this idea of Russia of the regions. This is like the divide to conquer idea of a nation. You get rid of federal power and you give all power to local control, to have a hyper divided nation that's not unified in any meaningful way, and thus more able to be economically colonized by an oligarchy, which has always been what that sort of thing has been about. And he's been a proponent of that. And he's also spoken openly about having himself presidential ambitions. And he's come close to becoming prime minister on several occasions. So he's not like a little local mayor. This is a big deal.
Yeah.
And so Golikova has been protecting him. And I think, again, when you look at the amount of fight between the federal and local regions on a variety of points, including most recently when Golikova announced that the federal government, she said in November 3rd, 2021, she said by February 1st, 2022, she had announced, and Sobyanin re-amplified this, that the federal authorities were going to now implement and enforce finding people, demanding total vaccination, unquestioning, because there's a very low vaccination rate in Russia. People just generally don't believe the bullshit the way we do in the West. And we saw within 3 weeks, the Russian federal authorities came out and said, any such thing will have no weight in law. This will not happen. And as we saw, especially since the beginning of February, it has had no weight. It did not happen. There was total pushback. And instead, what we've seen is a massive pullback from a lot of these mandates that have been underway for 2 years, especially which accelerated since the Ukraine conflict, where I think Putin just realized, I'm not playing this game anymore. I don't have to. There's no more advantage to trying to play this game of like, okay, we're on board with, what you're saying. So I think there are a lot of analysts who have made a bit of a career and reputation for themselves in the last several months, especially attacking Russia without taking any of this context into consideration, just simply over the myopic examination of their COVID response protocols, who now don't have that much to write about as they used to, because Russia has, again, pulled back on a lot of these things. And now they're devoting a lot of their attention just to China and about how China's been responding, especially in Shanghai with their current lockdown. And the other variable, just to add to that, is the bioweapons. Like, I mean,
I was just going to say. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So go for it.
No, I mean, I also, sorry, just wanted to intercede for 1 second, because I also wanted to say it's interesting that Sobyanin's, Sergey Sobyanin's rhetoric has also slightly changed since February the 24th, whether he kind of sees the writing on the wall and is perhaps starting to edge back towards or away from the whole kind of Davos Agenda 2030 paradigm, because he's been talking, hasn't he, about home ownership, land ownership, releasing cash, enabling small businesses, et cetera, in line with Putin's speeches, of course, about increasing social benefits and protecting the public from sanctions. So is he kind of coming back in line with Putin at the moment? Because again, that seems to be a complete switch from what obviously from the entire Agenda 2030 Great Reset, right? Because he's talking about home ownership, he's talking about land ownership, he's talking about enabling private enterprises, generating cash, supporting local labor, creating jobs, which is complete anathema. Right, to the Western-centric view.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't trust him as a moral being, but I think that Putin trusts him as far as being somebody who is open to his own self-preservation.
Yeah, well,
will adapt to whatever allows him to preserve his existence. So to that sense, yeah, I think that he does intend to carry out something that he knows that if he doesn't, he's out.
And I mean, this is politics.
Yeah, exactly. You can't get anything done if you just want to like clear house of everybody corrupt. My God, you're done for.
It's just not going to happen.
I
mean, I always say to people, even if you don't understand, or even if you can't put yourself in a political environment, you don't fully understand because you've never worked in it. But just think about corporate politics. It's the same thing, only the stakes are much higher, right? Than in corporate business or industry, anything like that. You will have the same battles, but once it gets to that level of power structure, then the battles become high risk, possibly very lucrative, and very unstable, and you have to navigate that. And that's reality. And I think people, when they are analyzing, do sort of forget about this reality. It's a real world. It's
Mm.
it's it's not, and I really don't want to dismiss this analysis out of hand. In a sense, it's good that it's there because it's making us think. It's making us actually take it into consideration and examine it, etc. That's a good thing. That's a positive. Um, but I think, I mean, for example, I live here in Syria, and I see to what extent the maneuvering goes on to try and dig this country out of the Western savagery and sadism and barbarism that has been, absolutely grinding this country down
Mhm.
for the last 11 years. You know, people criticized President Assad, for example, for going to meet with the UAE, because, of course, the UAE is currently involved in decimating Yemen, for
Yeah.
example. But this is realpolitik. In a
Mhm.
sense, it's not that you abandon your principles, but you have to have a greater vision. You have to be working towards what you want, and those steps that you take towards what you want are not necessarily going to please all the people all the time. That's impossible,
Yeah.
right?
And the irony to all of this, I think, is that for those more selfish, narrow-minded actors who are just in it for money or personal self-interest at the expense of the nation they're a part of and the people,
Mm,
irony is that if they go along with the sort of thinking that we see like from the economic orientation of China or Russia regarding, look at Putin's and I mean people like Lavrov and Shoigu and many other nationalists and patriots, look at their initiatives, what they want to do and have openly spoken about and have tried to do and done to a certain extent, but not as much as they want to, of
mm.
opening up the Arctic and Siberia to real massive development, since it's super underdeveloped. It's like Canada in many ways, except um yeah, just the resource potential, the development potential is so big. It's tied also increasingly to the a northern branch of the Belt and Road Initiative, what's called the Polar Silk Road. So I mean, they would make so much money if they went along with these sorts of projects of building large scale infrastructure the way China's been doing for the past 8 years,
Mm.
um around the world, not just in China, pulling people out of poverty, but creating new markets, creating new technologies, new resource bases by introducing. It's like a central control, but it's got a what Glaziev, Putin's advisor, who's gaining hegemony, or not hegemony, but he's on the ascendancy right now in terms of his political influence currently. He's made this very clear that China has tapped into the balance of central command, but at the same time with flexible management structures economically. Because you have to have both change and no, like you have to have the ability to harmonize the various parts of a complex system, which is a nation, but also a, a community of nations working together. That requires a harmonization of action. So you do have to have central command abilities. You do have to have a national bank the way China does have a state controlled bank. They didn't let their banking system become privatized the
Mm.
way the rest of the world has under private central banks, and especially like Russia in the 90s. Their bank of Russia was reconstitutionalized under a privatized central banking structure beholden to the IMF and Western financiers, and it operates not for the benefit of the Russian people or the nation. Whereas China is different. That's how they can get a lot of things done. They can emit large scale credit, with 10, 20-year maturities, very low interest for projects that are very specific,
Mm.
right? Not speculation. It's not a floating exchange rate type of idea of just speculating on the yuan or on a commodity without a concern for what are you building. So they're able to do, like, they've been able to build 40,000 kilometers of high speed rail. They're going to double that in a short enough period of time. They've become like leading cutting edge innovators, and all of the things that the West used to be pioneers of. China has like leapt ahead and are doing things that no human being has ever done before in quantum computing and high speed rail, maglev rail, space tech, nuclear fusion, all sorts of things. Um, and they're helping other countries. This is the other thing, for those who say that China is a part of the Great Reset. Just keep in mind that the Great Reset core religious doctrine is stripping nations of their economic sovereignty and stripping the ability of humanity to support its people through a deindustrial orientation. That's what the shutdown of food is all about. The food production right now, farmers are getting paid all over North America to destroy their crops, and they're getting paid 50% more than the market value of their crops. And they're being threatened with fines and punishment by the federal authorities, by Biden, if they don't do that, by having their next year's loans withheld. So it's like there's a massive intention right now with similar things in Europe to destroy food production, to allow only those food productions that are in conformity with the Bill Gates sort of way of thinking about a GMO Monsanto type of operation, and to go for only forms of energy that are compatible with a deindustrialized green economy, a society that cannot sustain more than maybe 10% or maybe 20% of what it currently has as far as people. So there's that aspect, whereas China is doing the opposite. Just look at what they're doing. They're building full spectrum economies with industrial factories and manufacturing, and also training for Africans and other people in other countries of Asia to train generations of highly specialized engineers to continue the work of maintaining and improving upon those things being built as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and other things. Look at the energy that Russia and China both are offering to African nations like Egypt, and many others, to help them develop their own sovereign nuclear energy systems, which has been verboten for many, many years. The only one country in Africa permitted to have nuclear power is South Africa, which it was allowed only because of it being under white apartheid rule for much of the Cold War. And so they were allowed to have that. But Black Africa, there's a technological racist apartheid against most of Africa, based on this imperial agenda that most people are not fully appreciative of, where Africa has been told since the 50s, no, you might want Kwame Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba, or, name a Pan-African nationalist who gets assassinated. But you might want, they're told, to have advanced technology like we do. But in reality, that's too antithetical to your natural savage tribal ecosystem lifestyle. And so we will allow you to have appropriate technologies. Who determines what's appropriate? It's the same people who want to destroy Africa, who want to keep them enslaved and steal their resources, who say you can have windmills. That doesn't disrupt your ecosystems or intelligence. You have to have a very advanced education system to produce people who can maintain upon and improve a nuclear energy economy. And you can, let's say, if you have solar panels all over Africa, the way Biden and Ursula von der Leyen are drooling over for their Build Back Better Green New Deal for the world, all it requires educationally for Africans is like whatever knowledge you need to be a squeegee to wipe them clean every day from the dust storms. And as that electricity is then sent to Europe as an energy colonialism. And none of that benefits the Africans. So China's doing the opposite. They're actually helping these countries develop high-speed rail in Kenya, in Congo, in the Addis Ababa to Djibouti rail line, which could feasibly even connect into Yemen if we can maintain this peace process. And it requires, again, working with people who have done bad things throughout the ages of globalization. A lot of the African leaders that are migrating or changing. They could smell where the future is going. They could see that the West that they're holding to is collapsing faster and faster. It's not something very attractive to be a part of. And they see that an actual viable offer is on the table for them to have a future. And so they, on one level, some of them are just doing it because they're going to make a lot of money by industrializing and working with China. Others just realize maybe some of them actually are having a change of heart as deeper quality, human beings. Maybe that's happening. And I'd like to think it does. Like Abraham Lincoln said, when he was asked, why are you surrounding yourself with all of these people who've wanted to destroy your career for so long? And he's like, look, people get cynical and they're like, he was all about keeping your enemy or your friends closer and your enemies closer. But he had a different, more sublime view. He was a creative, very strong human being. And he made the point that, look, I destroy my enemies by turning them into my friends. That paradigm works. It really does. And you could see that after he died, even some of those political enemies that he had surrounded himself with for 4 years, some of them actually continued to fight for his policies against the US deep state that had started taking over control of the US after his murder. So it does work. I think human beings, you have to have a sense, ultimately, you know, we're born fundamentally good. And somewhere along the way, you know, we can go off the rails and go onto the wrong path. But because we're corrupt, like, you know, Augustine had this beautiful proof in his writings, that the fact that we can, either institutions or individuals can be corrupted, is only proof that we're ultimately good. And he's saying this in opposition to those who say that, you know, human beings are born evil, right, to be controlled by a priesthood or something. And he's like, no, because if we were born evil, there would be no meaning to the word corruption. We just would be what we are. But the fact that we all acknowledge that things can be corrupted means that there was something good at the root. And that includes, like I said, both institutions which act corrupted, like the UN, and Russia and China both confuse, again, a lot of jaded Western analysts, because they often speak well about the need to base international law not on a rules-based order, but on the principles of the UN Charter. And a lot of people, you know, who are good researchers, I think good-hearted people like James Corbett and others, will say, aha, look, they talk about the UN Charter, the UN, that's the one world government institution. Thus, they're bad. And it's like, well, if you actually look at the UN Charter from 1945-46, you start seeing that in the Charter is signs of something viable. Like there was some original idea that enshrines the sovereignty of nation states in the Charter. It's not a one world government. It's embedded on the premise that every nation is sovereign, that there can be no military aggressive intervention from one country onto another. There's a lot of enforcement of the concept of the win-win cooperation, you know, the harmonization of economic activity that benefits all players, not zero-sum game. So these are all viable things if they're actually followed. And the problem has just been for 70, 80 years that the UN has been taken over by forces who will just corrupt and undermine they'll turn everything to shit. So
and in fact, they've just, you know, for all of Russia being part of the club, the UNGA has just suspended Russia's participation in the UNHRC, I guess, with the view to, you know, go after them for the alleged Busha massacre. So, I mean, we'll come back to that, because I want to talk about the various clubs that Russia has definitely not been allowed to join, which also, in my view, sort of contradicts a little this narrative that they are a part of the Western-centric technocracy. I mean, I think just after the Western orchestrated, or the US orchestrated coup in Ukraine in 2014, in Putin's speech at the Valdai Club in October 2014, he mentioned the fact that the talks on Russia's accession to the WTO lasted 19 years. You know, when Putin spoke to Clinton, wasn't it? That came out fairly recently in 2000. And he asked him if Russia would be allowed to join NATO, and there was simply no answer. So he was rebuffed. You know, and I think that these are very important yardsticks to see how Russia has, in fact, been ostracized, in my view, from this power base. And now we're seeing that becoming even more apparent. But I want to go back, because I'm sorry I interrupted you when you were about to talk about the biolabs, and the fact that these, I mean, in Ukraine, the biolabs are obviously close to the borders with Russia, but equally the US has established these so-called defensive biolabs on the borders with Iran and with China. And I think you were going to perhaps make the connection with the Chinese and Russian response to COVID as perhaps having some relation to the potential threat from these biolabs.
Mhm. Well, that's the other thing. Yeah. I mean, the important thing to keep in mind is that from the mindset and thinking of the Russian and Chinese intelligentsia, they have been looking at this entire pandemic period from the very start as a potential launching of a U.S. Generated, racially specific or racially targeted pathogen.
Mm.
They are not stupid. They've been following very closely, especially since the September 2000 Rebuilding America's Defenses report, written by Paul Wolfowitz, I think the brother of Victoria Nuland's Robert Kagan, and a variety of other neocons as part of the Project for a New American Century. And in it, I mean, it's very clear, they're explicit that the warfare of the 21st century will take on a utilization of ethnic targeted pathogens. That's literally what they say, on top of cyber warfare and other things, all to stop at all costs the rise of any opposition blocks to U.S. hegemony, Iran number 3. So, the Chinese have been looking at this development for a long time. We saw this thing grow massively after the false flag anthrax attack in December 2001, and which was, again, some low-level FBI associated character working at Fort Detrick was thrown under the bus and blamed for being the guy, radicalized by Al Qaeda videos to send these things. There's been a lot of documentation that this was an inside job. This said nothing. This guy was a patsy. But it did justify the buildup of things like the BioShield Act of 2004 under Cheney and Victoria Nuland together. Other Rhodes Scholars, because there's so many Rhodes Scholars over this story, but you have, I'm forgetting now. Forgetting names. Sorry. But the BioShield Act was... It was a $50 billion, it created a $50 billion budget specifically for the creation and maintenance of an international array, not just of the 11 BSL-4 labs inside of the US, but internationally. What has now come to the surface, I didn't realize it was so many. The Chinese Foreign Ministry estimates over 300 US biolabs, which have all the capacities of weaponizing pathogens. Many of them, as we've come to discover, have been in Ukraine. Many of them are around China's perimeter. And again, China has been operating under this basic DEFCON 2 procedure. DEFCON 1 is like nuclear war imminent. DEFCON 2 is the step before that. I think Russia has been in a similar mind state. Lavrov and many other Russian leaders have spoken out openly about their concerns since 2016. I've been seeing the early, but maybe there's earlier remarks warning of their concern of the Georgian and Ukrainian US Pentagon funded bioweapons labs. Which, the more you look at this stuff, right, you start seeing that the same figures who are behind the growth of the Nazi operations like Azov's and Aidar in Ukraine are also all over the bioweapons growth, including people like Hunter Biden, who made a fortune at Burisma, the biggest natural gas company, which is owned under 2 shell companies by Kolomoskoy. Igor Kolomoskoy, the Ukrainian Israeli billionaire. But also, this guy has, through this laptop that we've now been told, okay, it was real the whole time, there's material on there demonstrating that his company, Rosemont Seneca, had provided the seed capital and funding for Metabiota, which has been the contractor maintaining these biolabs in Ukraine. So you see all of this stuff sort of circling all around the same nasty set of low-level characters on so many levels. And Kolomoskoy is I know you've written about this and spoken about this, but one of the biggest backers and financiers behind the Azovs, despite the fact that he's Israeli. He doesn't care. He has no loyalty to the Israeli people. He's more than happy to watch, his own people burn and die on behalf of a higher power that he's beholden to, and will do anything to, advance that. He has no, he's one of these like useful mercenaries, kind of like Soros. He doesn't care about anything but the power and privilege that he can get. So these guys
Mm.
are all over this operation, and it's really just important to keep that parasite in mind, because that's what the Russians have been looking at. They've taken over, as far as I could tell, control of the 30 or so biolabs in Ukraine, which Victoria Nuland, had said these are bio research facilities when we control them, but when Russia owns them, then all of a sudden we can call them bioweapons facilities. China, I think, as well, like the fact that Larry Romanov is a Canadian who's a professor in China, has been based there for 20 years. He's written extensively, very fascinating reports. I couldn't recommend them enough on specifically the issue of China's response to COVID. And he made a point that for the first, I think it's the first month up until like the end of February of 2020, only Han Chinese people first in Wuhan and around that province were the only ones to actually suffer from COVID. And also then when it began to somehow leap, it skipped the mainland because they locked down the province in which Hubei province. They locked it down. So there was no more traces of anybody outside of Hubei in China getting or acquiring COVID for many weeks. And then all of a sudden, despite it not spreading beyond Hubei, it made it all of a sudden to the United States. Like, how did it make that leap? And then to some places in Europe and Canada. And it's like, these were all Han Chinese people in Canada, in the US, in Europe for the first, all the way up, he makes the point, until February. And then other variations began to spring forth that targeted Iranians aggressively. We don't know what these things are. We're being, the information control was very top down. But it's all very anomalous. And I think whatever is going on in Shanghai right now, whatever the narrative is that they're going along with, as far as accommodating the World Health Organization narratives, is one thing. But I think when you actually look at how China's been thinking about this and acting, they're, I think, very much on the scenario that their intelligence agencies have given them insight that there is a deployment of something that is targeting the financial nerve center where 26 million people live in Shanghai, as part of a bio warfare attack. So there's that. So all of these things, I think, are increasingly coming to the surface.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think Alex Grainer, I also heard him expound that theory on an interview with Jesse Zurewell quite recently. Also, you mentioned Soros, who, of course, not only Soros was banned from Russia in 2015, but any NGOs in fact, there was a law against foreign NGOs, basically, wasn't there?
Yeah, 2015 was the big onslaught in Russia to expel all of Soros's operations. If you were to try to reset something up that was tied to any of his open society operations, you would go. It's illegal. You would go to prison. And a variety of other foreign-backed agencies, NGOs, were also illegalized in 2015. Before that, it took them a while to get around to actually having the ability to do that, because again, it's not like Putin did not want to do that, but again, something just to appreciate the structures of real power that do exist protecting these treacherous operations were very strong, and it took them all the way till 2015 to do it. China was able to do it much earlier, 26 years earlier, in fact.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I think a lot of anti-China haters have to they tend to run away from some of these paradoxes. And they don't think about it enough. Why did China, if George Soros had so much power in China to the point that he even co-controlled a think tank, one of the biggest economic liberalizing think tanks, with the head of the Chinese Communist Party himself, Zhao Ziyang, was like the guy who co-ran this with Chen Yitzi, his assistant, this think tank with Soros, all the way up until 1989. Why did Soros get banned? Why did Chen Yitzi go to prison? Why did Zhao Ziyang get stripped of all of his power and get put under house arrest for 15 years until he died? Why did his operatives who worked with this network, this deep state fifth column in China, who were also giving speeches calling for the fifth industrial revolution in 1983, I said fourth industrial revolution in 1983, why did they all either have to many went to prison. Many escaped through Operation Yellowbird via the Hong Kong triads coordinated by MI6 and CIA. This is even on Wikipedia. I'm not giving secret information here. Out of Tiananmen Square and out of Beijing and into safer territory in California, Vancouver. This is part of what I think, if people began to look a little bit behind things like Epoch Times and Falun Gong and Li Hongji, this weird cultish head of this kind of like, Falun Gong is sort of like the Scientology of Asia. This guy's speeches to CNN, even in 1999, he's very clear. He sees himself as a messiah who's keeping the equilibrium from an international, interdimensional battle of aliens. He thinks that, and that's what he tells people when you get higher up. It's not just a meditation group. This is obviously, it has all of the earmarkings of an intelligence agency cult deployed to undermine target nations, which is why China banned them in 1997. And this is what I think is behind. It's these foreign these people who had avoided arrest in 89, who have been based as a foreign nucleus against the China pushing Soros color revolution ever since, utilizing all sorts of psyops that are very attractive to a lot of right wingers and conservative types who are suspicious, especially of things like Great Reset. But rather than seeing the causal hand of Anglo-American intelligence and what this thing actually is, they're being deflected in a bit of a smoke and mirrors operation, much like is what happened to many people who are followers of John Birch Society literature in the 1950s and 60s during the Cold War. They're being deflected to see that, yes, there is this conspiracy. Yes, it's out to destroy traditional values. That's all true. But it's really the Chinese, the big bad guys are the Chinese or the Russians, who are the ones, or a bit of both, who are actually at the heart of evil. And they don't see that. No, the actual hand behind this is the same which carried out provably the assassinations and murders of all of the American presidents who died while in office, all 8 of them, plus Bobby Kennedy. It's a supranational financier oligarchy. It's been around for a long time. It's had 5th columns in the USA, what you could consider stay-behinds, after 1776. Some of them went to British territory in Canada. That's why there's English speakers like me in Canada. It's not just a little French colony of Quebec like it used to be in 1776. They were given sanctuary. They were given, they were the United Empire loyalists. They didn't want to go with the idea that no, all men are created equal and that government should be founded upon the consent of the governed. They disagreed with that. They liked the old hereditary structures of power that they were beholden to, much like the Russian oligarchs like Chubai today. There's a whole bunch of them. And some of them didn't leave to Canada. Some of them stayed behind. And some obeyed by the new rules of Ben Franklin in Washington and others who actually wanted to create something genuine. And some of them went along with the new rules of the game. Other ones only went along to the degree that they could subvert it from within, as, again, a 5th column stay behind. And this includes people like Aaron Burr, who assassinated Alexander Hamilton in 1804, who tried to 3 conspiracies that he was caught guilty for, one of which he even went to trial for until he escaped to Canada, to carve up the United States into to northern and southern, or north, southern, and eastern, western confederacies with him as the king, all into the British. And he was again caught in one of these conspiracies directly, and he's celebrated today, keep in mind, as a hero. Now, he is the guy who is the founding father of Wall Street. He's the guy who used taxpayer money in 1799 to create the Bank of Manhattan instead of putting it towards building a water system the way he was supposed to. And he was vice president of the time, so he was able to do whatever he wanted. He created this private Bank of Manhattan that became the basis for what later became J.P. Morgan and Chase Manhattan. All of Wall Street and the entire hive of traders inside of the USA, what were called Boston Brahmins, the Boston banking families and of New England and New York, they were all working in his nexus. These are like the Chubais, right? The Anatoly Chubais.
Yeah, exactly.
And they've been there the whole time, running assassinations of Lincoln, of William Harrison in 1840, who tried to revive the Hamilton's National Bank, had the legislation passed in Congress and Senate, and then right before he could sign it into law, to gain back control of a national bank, instead of having the private financiers with their Wall Street assets controlled by London, in the city of London, which even then was the center of world finance, just like it is today. before he could sign into law, after 3 months of being president, he dies for no good reason. And then, Zachary Taylor dies 10 years after that, who's also trying to revive this policy. And then Lincoln dies with his murderer deployed from Montreal, Canada, a British base of operations for the Confederacy. And I mean, I can go through every single example, and that's why I wrote my books, to just show this case thing. All the way to JFK, whose murderer was deployed from Montreal through Permindex, which is a Montreal-based corporation that had been caught carrying out 2 attempted assassinations of de Gaulle. This is an assassination bureau, and Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, even wrote about this extensively. So there's always been this Anglo-Canadian operation with branches in the USA, with branches all over Europe, with branches in Russia that got more power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And also they had branches in China, but the Chinese actually expelled and destroyed this whole Soros fifth column thing. Like Soros, people think of him as the big bad guy. And it's like, well, wait a minute. And they say, oh no, he couldn't be a stooge for Britain because look at what he did to the British pound. He made $1 billion in a day by betting against the pound in what was it, 1991 or 92. And okay, well, you could say that, or you could say, well, the British had a good excuse to not join the Euro system. Like they kept control of their pound sterling.
Yeah.
And even though they'd been pretending they were going to join the Maastricht Treaty all the way up until that point, their excuse was, well, look, we have too much economic chaos because of Soros, so now we can't do it, but we'll join later, we promise. Never happened. They were never going to get into the cage that they wanted their victims to go into. They knew it was always designed to explode. And Soros got his whole money, his capital came from I think it was Evelyn de Rothschild in 1968, who gave him all of the money that he needed to start Quantum Hedge Fund, the world's first hedge fund, as a pirate mercenary deployed in the age of liberalization and deregulation to destroy nations by speculating on currencies. So this is the sort of thing that was done to China. They were destroyed. They had a one-child policy forced onto them by the Club of Rome, which was the thing that was at the heart of its computer models for population control, were at the heart of the Davos creation in 71. And the Club of Rome is they brought their computer models into China using Song Jian, a leading cyberneticist, just like this guy I mentioned earlier from Russia. Remember Georgy Shcherovitsky? These cyberneticists, they think of human beings like little automata that have to be controlled by a master elite of programmers from the top. These are transhumanists, and this did a lot of damage to China, but China was also, they had nationalists and patriots who were more astute than their Russian counterparts. They were able to expel Soros, who never forgave them, and kept control of their state banks. And through that, they've been able to maintain a type of operating system that's premised on an open, not a closed system. It's like a closed system means all of the limits are absolute. All you can do is fight for diminishing returns in a zero-sum game. It's scientifically the term used is entropic. It's subjected to the second law of thermodynamics. You cannot have more. You light a match, that fire is always going to be moving towards heat death. It's not going to make more fuel out of that match over time. It'll have less fuel to keep itself alive. That's how these people think of human societies, as systems that are like a fire that will always die down. And all you can do is consolidate power to reduce or prolongate as much as possible the inevitable heat death of the system. But they don't believe, they hate, or maybe they believe, but they see as a destabilizing and thus evil function human creativity that has a scientific power when it's being used well to discover things that are outside of the control system, the control system, right? Which we do when we discover electricity and apply that to humanity, to the productive process. All of a sudden, our potential to sustain more people at a higher quality of life with more access to our minds, because machines can do the work of 1,000 slaves. All of a sudden, we're mentally and spiritually emancipated from the materialist forces and those who control those forces, right, and the resources, which is what the empire always tries to do. So, I think it's important that people get into the paradigm of a Chinese Confucian trying to preserve their ancient civilization. It's 5,000 plus years old. The Indians as well. There's a reawakening, I think, of an appreciation of this open system concept of human nature and the obligation to conform your political economy and foreign policy around that scientifically demonstrable fact of our relationship to the universe and how our boundary conditions, unlike those of the animals, are relative and not absolute. They're relative to the discoveries we make or fail to make and apply to willfully modify our behavior, not have that behavior modified for us, but actually willfully in accordance with what our minds can discover to be true, which a good education system and culture should promote, which it doesn't in our part of the world. And it's just hard to get into that mindset because we live in such a cesspool of hypocrisy and lies. So it's hard to even imagine that something like people would often hear what I say and they're like, no, you're an idealized naive fool.
Yeah, I think that is and I have said that it's also the problem that a lot of the discourse is becoming more and more Western centric. And even it's moving away from the countries like, for example, Syria, Yemen, Latin America, Lebanon, Iraq, etc., that will very probably benefit from the Russia-China bloc with Iran and India and Pakistan in there, pushing back against Western imperialism and supremacy, and effectively leading us, we hope, to a multipolar world, and one where, these subjugated countries I keep saying this, we've been in Syria, they've been living the Great Reset for 12 years. And anything that liberates these countries from the chains of imperialism is a good thing, and I support that. But one other point that I just wanted to cover, because my electricity's just gone out, so my battery on my laptop's going to start dying fairly soon. Is we talked about, because just to reinforce the point that we're making, I think that Russia and China are not part of the Western vision for a great reset, which is destructive. Effectively, it's the destruction of humanity, in my view. And I have been arguing that in my belief, COVID-19, yes, was a portal to all these elements of the Great Reset, and the war against the working class, against the little people, as I call them. That's in their view, of course. But in my view, it was also the start of this major provocation against Russia that has led to the situation we now have in Ukraine and this global transformation. Not that I think that they wanted to achieve the positive transformation. I think they wanted the destruction of Russia as a from their point of view, a threatening global power. And we talked about what happened in January 2020, which of course was only a couple of months before the COVID project started in March. That there was a coup attempt in Russia. There was also the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq by Trump. And also in 2019, America renounced the nuclear agreement. I think it was the INF and the Open Sky agreements in 2019 and 2020. So there were a number of signs, in my view, that this war against Russia was incoming. And of course, the signs have been there for decades. But can you just talk about what you were talking about, what happened in January 2020?
Oh, yeah, that was such a high density of singularities, such an inflection point in world history. You pointed out many of them. The one of the points I would have to say as well for context is that in my assessment, the deep state in the United States didn't get less, like the Pentagon, the State Department, the military industrial complex didn't become like less independent since they killed JFK in '63. If anything, it's much more powerful even today than it was 50 years ago. And I don't see Trump necessarily. I think that Trump really was a bit of a chaos factor for the Great Resetters, and not necessarily at the heart of a lot of the worst elements of his foreign policy. I can back that up. Like, I do think he really did like Putin a lot, and I think Putin liked him. I do think the same thing for when he went to China as a special guest at the Forbidden City. Here's the thing. So I said I could back it up. So the thing here with January 2020 was also the Davos summit, whereby George Soros gave a very revealing speech where he said the two greatest threats to his open society was Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative and Trump's USA as number one, number two. The reason for that was that was also the month, January, I think 5th, was the month that the US-China trade deal, phase one, went into operation, with the policy of the Chinese agreeing to buy $350 billion of US finished goods as part of a rehabilitation of the destroyed US industrial base that had been killed for 50 years of NAFTA and globalization. So Detroit, Philadelphia, that are annihilated. The idea was really to revive and retool those former industrial hubs. So China was the key component. You couldn't do it without the Chinese market. It's the most robust growth model in the world, and Trump knew that. So it was supposed to be a multi-phase operation, second phase, third phase, many other things, which were very hopeful. And I think that's why people like George Soros was pissing his pants about that prospect of that working out. COVID derailed all of that. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 months, it disintegrated increasingly as Trump has a lot. I mean, he seemed to really buy into the briefings he was being given on China's role in some of the stuff. It was insane. Not the brightest bulb on many levels. The other thing with the near war with Iran that had happened when January 3rd happened, Soleimani was killed by a U.S. Strike, as well as the lead negotiator in Iraq as well. There was a whole meeting being set up in Iraq between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the Iraqis were sort of the mediators. The former prime minister, I think it was Mahdi, had said that it was Trump who had originally pushed to try to negotiate this brokering of some sort of an entente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Mahdi, who was, I think, a good guy, he was ousted from I believe a Western fueled mass revolt. He was a friend of the Belt and Road. He actually signed Iraq onto the BRI. He recognized that the future of the Middle East, the survival is the southern corridor of the BRI, moving through and providing industrial economic reconstruction to Syria, Iraq, Iran, everywhere else. So anyway, that was all. He blamed Trump for it. He thought it was a trap that was set for him. I don't think that that's the case, because after Soleimani was killed, Trump immediately did get on the phone and had it was the embassy of Switzerland that had, since the 70s, a direct channel from the White House, and he made sure to bypass the State Department, where he was in direct communication with the Iranian leadership with the message, do not retaliate, just wait. And they had a full day of intense emergency negotiations over this red line. I think it was through like a fax machine in the Swiss embassy. Point is, there was a very controlled response, like Iran provided their counterattack, their retaliation with foreknotice that gave the U.S. a chance to like remove their people from the military base. There was no in response retaliation from the USA. It was a very controlled narrative that was created. That's unprecedented. That there would be that level of control of the response, and the Iranian military said, okay, justice has been served, yada yada. But it does seem like there was something renegade. And I think when you look at the people like John Bolton, who Trump has fired, or, Trump fired a lot of people. And I think that many of them, just like Putin has had to negotiate and keep people like, I mentioned a few of them, Golikova, many others in positions of power, even Alexei Kudrin, who he had fired in 2011, has been brought back into a very powerful position. A lot of them we had a lot of the same things in the US, except in the case of the US, it's a more controlled environment than Russia. So I don't fully know all the details. I know that he was happy to fire Bolton, and Bolton was quick to support the Democrats and the warmongers there. Pompeo was no special thing at all. He was a disaster and always was. I don't think Trump necessarily wanted Pompeo in. I don't know, but again, I don't understand all the power structures that he was negotiating with. All that to say, that was the month that, again, COVID was sprung on the world. The Chinese immediately began interpreting it like U.S. biolab attack. You had the downing of a Ukrainian jet that was flying out of Tehran into Kiev on, I think it was the 8th of January as well, which the Iranians were induced to shoot down. It seems like that might have been, there's a few scenarios hypothesizing why. It seems that a cyber attack is one of the most likely things to induce the Iranian radar sensors to interpret it as an incoming missile. There's a few other scenarios that I've seen that are reasonable, but I'm not too sure which is actually true. All that to say, the Iranians chose at that time to claim ownership for it. They felt that was the pathway to go. And what's interesting here is there's a lot of parallels to the 2014 shoot down of MH17 on so many levels. In the case of MH17 earlier, you had its flight path moved from moving across Crimea, which was the original flight path, to moving over the eastern Ukrainian region of Donbass. We don't know exactly why that was done. We do know that there were certain individuals who were owned employees. The dispatcher of the company or the contractor that carried out that command was an employee who worked for Igor Kolomoskoy. We know that the plane MH17 was owned by a company run by a company called Ukrainian International Airlines, whose main owner is Igor Kolomoskoy, who we've already talked about, and you've talked about a lot, as the main funder of Azovs and these other Nazis.
Zelensky.
And also Zelensky, I forgot to mention. So, there were a lot of strange things. And what was additionally strange is on January 15th, after Putin's State of the Union address, literally the day after, is where there was a near coup d'etat, it seems, in Russia, where the entire Russian government resigned. And it's not fully known what that was all about. But it seems like that was a part of a broader attempt to destabilize or undermine Putin. Medvedev was a part of it at that time. And we know that somebody who has been positioned after the murder, there was a murder of Mikhail Lesin, who was the former editor-in-chief of and founder of RT, Russia Today, in 2015 at the Washington offices, or in Washington. He was murdered. I think they called it a suicide, but there's so much evidence that this was not a suicide. Afterwards, his replacement, who was brought in, was this girl who's like this social media obsessed creature named Margarita Semyonin, who is the current editor-in-chief. And she had really done something very indicative and strange at that same time, right after Iran claims ownership of the shoot down by accident of the Ukrainian jet, passenger jet, killing, I think it was 200 something people. She all of a sudden goes on her Twitter account, and starts saying now Putin should take a lesson and man up and claim ownership for the MH17 flight that was shot down over Donbass, which immediately was amplified in Bloomberg press, all of the Western media, BBC and CNN, everything was amplifying this mass perception that, RT is supposed to be the voice of Putin, the voice of Russia. It actually was all coordinated with that same coup d'etat attempt. And I got to say, there's definitely good high value content in RT. I use it, or I was using it when I could still access it. However, there's also this other thing, which sometimes puts out psyops too, the extra emphasis on alien disclosure that they sometimes throw in, acting like it's real news, or the COVID fear porn, which was high amplitude in RT, or even giving traitors like Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister who Putin had fired via Medvedev in 2011 for being a traitor. They've been giving him a high value platform to spread his market gospel, criticizing Putin for being a nationalist and pushing always for supporting the Bank of Russia's policy of maintaining an IMF floating exchange rate speculative orientation and withholding funds that would otherwise be able to go for the growth and development of Russia the way China is doing. So this RT thing has a lot of good in it, but there's also evidence that came out in that period in January of this other thing as well, which again, it's just to appreciate the nuance of it all, that we can't just label things so easily with a black or white, but appreciate the nuance. The fact that Putin did survive that attempted coup is interesting. But the whole 2-year period has been a surreal, intense period in world history coming out of that, when a lot of potential was undone. During that time, the U.S., Trump, who had been pretty much bogged down as being a Russian stooge under Russiagate, completely made up for the whole time that, he was in there up until then. The last year of his presidency was just dealing with psyops of COVID, and he didn't get that much done. A lot of good things that could have happened didn't happen. And then there was a Soros funded and other coup d'etat, which resulted in a a take back of control by these Rhodes Scholars around Obama and Biden, who have now, the whole team has been back in power now for over a year, and going back to their same operations and then some to the extreme. And so, yeah, I think it's important to keep the nuance of Trump as well in mind, because it's such people tend to, again, get very polarized around the word and not appreciate the degree of messiness.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Matt, thank you again. I mean, I would love to keep talking, but I'm aware that I've taken up a lot of your time, and my laptop is literally going to conk out in about.
Pleasure, Vanessa. Anytime you want to talk more, we'll talk more. And I totally lost track of time. I've got another interview in 2 minutes, so your time.
Okay, you better go.
It was a pleasure.
All right, Matt. Take care, and thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.